All right, cool. Put that up a little bit more. Wish there was a way to increase the volume on my, maybe there is, on my mic. Advanced audio properties. Is this just... Okay, so that's at 150 now. It does get a little crinkly, but we'll just set that to 135. All right, I think that's as good as we're gonna get for now. Let's see. Nice, so that does actually cut out, it sounds like, a lot of that background. I turn off the fan for a second and see if that cleans up the audio a bit. It is a hot day in LA, so I'm actually, that doesn't sound like it makes much of a difference. So the fan's going back on for now. That ruins things. It doesn't matter, nobody's watching. That's some Roblox today. Sort of bouncing all over the place. All right, so this exists more than anything. This exists because I need to keep making little videos like this, doing little streams and so on. Um, there's nothing too crazy going on today. I mostly just want to get back on the pony a little bit. I just finished up that pitch for my pre-thesis concept for my grad program here at USC. So it sounds like I'm on track to start making this thing, which means there's going to be some content coming out hopefully this summer with a little bit of behind the scenes of my creative process. Okay. Um, I haven't talked about any of that too much just yet, just because I didn't know if I was going to be making it or what I was going to be making yet. So now that I have a little bit more of a sense, I think you're going to be seeing a good bit more of my filmmaking process on these streams. This will serve as kind of like a a repository, a journal of sorts, um, a log documenting how this thing comes into being. And, hopefully, because I'm going to be working with some other folks on here, I'm going to be working with composers, I'm going to be working with other artists, animators, modelers, etc. So, yeah, we'll definitely want to get some other folks on stream here at some point and kind of get their contributions as well, because none of these projects happen by yourself. It is going to be my own sort of narrative that I've arranged for this short film, right? I'm taking the lead on a lot of the process here, of course, but at the end of the day, this is going to be something that's going to require multiple people to bring into existence, and you're not going to get a full picture of what that looks like just listening to me talk. So hopefully we can get some of them as well to talk about what they do as they kind of come into the project. But the project literally just got cleared on Friday. So I still have a ways to go to sort of continue refining the design work, the story, the look of picture, um, and sort of laying out some technical foundations for what this project can be, right? So over the course of this summer, I'm going to be putting together a fresh pass on the animatic that I have for this thing so far. We're going to be spending time going over the material that I've put together so far and what my thought process has been, and what my thought process is going to be going forward as well. So all of that is in the mix to some degree or another, right? But yeah, it's gonna be fun. It's gonna be interesting. It's going to be very dynamic. And also, since I'm gonna have a little bit more time this summer without classes and so forth, we're gonna be spending some focused time going into creative processes and sort of learning a little bit more about how you make stuff in general, how I make stuff in general, how I've come to the skills and knowledge that I have, and hopefully kind of getting other people set to think through some of these things and have some interesting conversations about this stuff and go out and make their own stuff and all that sort of thing. So there's going to be a lot of development of this platform over the summer as well. And yeah, I'm looking forward to meeting whoever those people are going to be, because I know there's going to be people out there, right? So for today, this is again more of a kind of journal than anything right now. I'm not really trying to speak to a particular audience just yet. Since there's no audience watching here live, and it's probably going to be a while before anybody sees any of this stuff. Um, I don't even know if anybody's going to see any of these streams specifically, right? They're just sort of the learning, getting off the ground, figuring out how this works kind of stream. Hmm. So yeah, there's gonna be more of this going forward. But for today, um, I've just sort of laid out a couple of things that I want to start talking through and kind of getting my thoughts mapped. Uh, so I've got this little board here where these are things that I've been thinking about for a while. Okay. And it's something that's come up a lot for me over the past year or so. Really, it comes up again and again over the whole course of my career. People ask me, like, oh, how do you do this? How do you do that? How did you make this? Right? Uh, I use Blender and open source software a lot, and so people are often very interested in those tools. How do I get started with them? What are some good resources? Oh, I found this thing so difficult. There aren't good tutorials about this. Can you show me how to do that, etc. Um, and I really enjoy sort of getting into the details of these things with people and sort of showing them my workflows and helping them find ways to do things that they're more interested in doing, etc. Um, and I would say that the way that I've learned how to make things is fairly not necessarily that unique, but it's not the typical way that you would learn these things if you were to go through a traditional art school program, right? I'm largely self-taught. Uh, and especially when it comes to 3D software, right? Like this grad program is sort of the most formal education that I've really ever had in the traditional sort of Hollywood 21st century creative workflow, right? Um, Everything else that I've done, I kind of had to figure out how to do myself, or I've worked on very unusual projects that have required me to find ways of doing things that maybe there isn't a clear roadmap yet for how this is done. And a lot of times I've had to do this sort of thing on a very small budget or no budget at all, right? Or there have been things that I've wanted to learn or been interested in that are simply prohibitively expensive to get into, right? And especially kind of coming from, where I come from and all, there wasn't an abundance of these kinds of tools or people doing these kinds of work. Uh, and so you sort of learn to tinker and do things yourself, right? And I'm at a point in my life now where I've been doing these things long enough that I feel fairly confident being able to sort of map out what I do and how I got there, right? And that's a big part of the work that I want to do with this channel. Um, and in particular, you know, building some kind of series of, I don't even really want to call them guides, but like sort of notes on the map, right? uh, a sort of map of the territory of modern creative work and the tools that are available and the workflows that exist and are available, and just sort of notes on how someone might navigate that map, right? So what I'm sort of thinking of right here, and there is a document that I'm preparing as well, right? Um, a couple of documents that will become publicly available over time, right? But you can sort of see here some of what I'm talking about, some of what I'm interested in. Okay. Right now, this is just a list of topics. Okay. This isn't really detailed thoughts as yet, but these thoughts are going to become more detailed as we spend time on this stream going over these things, right? Uh, but for today, more than anything, I want to explain all of this, the sort of the overview of what I'm trying to accomplish here. Okay. This is a project about creative independence is the sort of most direct way that I can think to say this right now. Uh, but essentially, we live in a time that's this is relatively unique historically, where if you want to do high level creative work, the sorts of processes and tools that you need access to and that you need to understand are perhaps more sophisticated than they've ever been in history, right? We're talking about 3D modeling, advanced image manipulation. Uh, of course, there's all the stuff that people are talking about around generative algorithms and different sort of smart tools, right? Computers have changed so much about how we make things. And unfortunately, the the sort of industry standard tools that have kind of dominated the way that we are taught and learn and the way that studios make things, etc., are often prohibitively expensive, uh, often much more poorly built than what we are sort of led to believe. Uh, and, you know, as a result of that, very difficult to access and to get into and to learn, right? Especially if you're still learning a lot of these fundamentals, right? If you don't know yet, how to do digital painting, learning digital painting and learning Photoshop at the same time can be incredibly complex, right? And Photoshop is one of the easier things to kind of wrap your head around in terms of creative software, right? But even just over the last few years, I've used Photoshop for decades at this point. Actually, like, yeah, like maybe decades plural is stretching it, but like at least 15 years. Uh, probably more than that by now. Uh, and even in that time, right? And my dad used Photoshop in his work in his business a lot. I've known people who've used Photoshop a lot longer than me. The software has gotten, sort of bloated over time, and there are bugs that are mounting, and there's various things that for example, a digital painter might want them to pay attention to that Adobe just does not prioritize in Photoshop, and the sort of the business around how this sort of thing is created, the exploitative license structures, the you know, the sneaky access to your data, the sneaky licensing agreements that Adobe puts you through. All of this stuff gives a lot of folks pause, whether you've been in the industry for a long time or whether you're looking to get into this kind of work. There's a bit of a crisis going on right now with these creative tools. And I would love to talk about, there's a video out right now that's just called Creative Software. And I'll look that up and show that to y'all. It's an incredibly good video. It's long. It's a long one. So I don't think we're going to get the chance to really go over it on stream, but hopefully at some point we can go over um, at least pieces of it. It's called For Profit parentheses Creative Software from End Vertex. Let me just and it's a very, very thorough video. Yeah, at some point it would actually be nice to look at some of this because they go over a lot in a lot of detail the sort of history of Adobe and the history of Autodesk and how these different softwares have evolved over time, how the licenses have evolved on these things over time. Very reflective of my own experience as well, watching this video. Sort of enchanting, and they do a lot of very, very interesting little animated scenes, right? A lot of their own kind of original animated characters and stuff in there, which is it's a very charming essay overall, very well researched, very well constructed, and more people should see this, especially if you are in a creative field. Um, but seeing this kind of really gave me the impression that the thoughts that I've been working through for a long time, I'm not the only one thinking about these things, right? Clearly, End Vertex is thinking about these things. There's a lot of other artists in my personal life that think about these things. There's friends of mine, people who aren't even creative professionals, who are dealing with similar issues around software and sort of controlling their own work and feeling like companies are being increasingly exploitative in terms of the licenses that they're putting on you and the limits in terms of what kind of options you might have if you want to get out of these types of exploitative arrangements. It's tough, right? It's tough. That being said, there are ways in which you can claw back some of that control and have a type of work that you have more control over. Maybe not complete control, but more control. And I think that that's really important, especially if the sort of work you do ever requires you to be independent. If you're doing skill-based work, that you're carrying skills with you, regardless of what company you work for, or regardless of what clients you're serving. You got to be able to take your skills with you. You got to be able to take your work with you. You got to be able to put out a portfolio that shows the work that you do at its best, right? Uh, and while it's very good and in fact necessary to understand how to work inside of tools like the Adobe Suite or Autodesk or Maxon tools, etc., uh, you really can't, especially in this environment, you can't allow yourself to become dependent on these tools because it is going to damage your ability to put out your best portfolio and stay competitive in the industry and all that sort of thing, right? Uh, a lot of times artists are getting hired for jobs off of Instagram now, right? If you're not able to put out consistently really dynamic and interesting work, whether that's on Instagram or YouTube or just going to shows or festivals or whatever, right? Art is communicative. It's an expressive kind of activity. If you're just sitting on that work or if you're not able to make that work, then you're not able to be an artist, frankly, right? So it's great if you've got a job at a studio and they're paying for all of your tools and you're comfortable there and you know you're going to be able to just move from high-end studio to high-end studio and always have the tools and always have the equipment that you need to create your work and always be able to put out interesting stuff. Uh, but a lot of folks are in much more dynamic and often precarious positions that just require them to be able to carry a lot more of what they need to do their work with them, right? Um, and in general, I think that as a society, moving towards economic models and creative models and productive models that put more control in the hands of the people actually doing the work is really important. It's very important. And I think it ultimately helps to build a fairer, more just, and more enjoyable society for everybody to participate in, right? You have more ownership in your life, right? And I think that that's important as well. Um, and we can talk more about sort of the principles behind my thoughts here and where all of this stuff is coming from. But I think that gives you sort of a notion of the background that I'm coming to this from. Mm. And so with that in mind, let's look a little bit at the particulars here. Um, so we're talking about this idea of creative independence. And a lot of that is going to revolve around open source tools. Okay. A lot of that's going to revolve around open source tools. Open source is something that's evolved a lot over the years. It can mean a lot of different things in different contexts. We're specifically talking about creative software, right? And so when I talk about open source, what really matters there is that the code that is used to build the software itself is not locked behind a paywall or kept proprietary in any way, which means that there are people out there who can access that code and either create their own versions of the software or host the software, on their own servers or download the whole package and have the whole package locally, right? Uh, they can make modifications to the software very easily, etc. This makes it very robust if, say, for example, the software gets bought out at some point and goes private. Well, there might still be older versions floating around, etc., or somebody can fork it. That knowledge is now in the community. It's not just about the software itself being available for people to use free of charge. It's about the knowledge that creates that software being more diffused through the broader creative and technical community, right? Supporting open source software is a very important piece of how I see this overall project. And of course, it relates directly to some of my most important tools, right? Krita, Blender, right? GIMP, right? These are all open source projects. I don't use GIMP. Uh, I've heard very good things about the latest update to GIMP, and I'm actually intrigued to check it out. I have access to the Affinity license, right? Which gets into the second thing here, which is perpetuals, right? Not everything is going to be able to be free or entirely free, at least not in the sort of economy that we have today. Maybe in some fantastical future, we could imagine that, there are, for example, public funds that go towards the building of certain kinds of tools or supporting certain kinds of like open source projects, etc. That's probably the only way that you really get around this issue. Uh, but in the meantime, there are going to be things that you have to pay for, right? And that's probably going to be the case more or less forever, at least for the rest of our lives. uh, and that's not necessarily a bad thing so long as the terms and conditions are reasonable and the price is reasonable, right? So I'm a big proponent of quality software that offers a good price and a good deal, right? A good sort of contract with that license, right? The Affinity Suite has been very good to me. I think that it's a very, it's a very good investment, right? If you do a lot of 2D graphical stuff, if you ever have to deal with, sort of layouts, business cards, brochures, booklets, right? If you have to do any kind of like photo editing, if you ever have to mess around with vector and bitmap images, right? Affinity is solid software, very well designed, very thoughtful in how it's built, and one of the things that I think is a big advantage of Affinity, and this is, I think, a common feature of a lot of perpetual licenses, the good ones, right? Um, they really just do one thing, right? It is graphic design software. It gives you all the tools that you need to generate two-dimensional graphics. However you're going to do that. It gives you all the tools you need to manage print and cuts and layouts and vectors and bitmaps and text and brushes and all of that kind of stuff, right? It's not as robust as a purely painting app as I've found, right? There are a few little things that make it a little bit clumsy for me as a painting app, but you can definitely paint in there, right? And if you're not drawing and painting every single day as your main workflow, but you still need to do it sometimes, or you want to do it a little bit at the beginning of a process, for example, to sort of sketch out a logo or a layout. Affinity, Affinity Designer in particular is honestly, I would say, better than a lot of what Adobe has to offer just because of not what the tools are, but how the tools are integrated, right? In Adobe, you're jumping between a lot of different apps that oftentimes don't feel like they're fully built for the workflow that you're trying to accomplish, right? Affinity, I think, understands very well that illustration, Affinity Designer is a sort of Illustrator equivalent, kind of, right? But it also does bitmap pixel-based drawing and painting, right? There's a whole suite of tools in there. Everything you'd want, a wide selection of brushes, different guides, selection tools, gradients, fills, all that kind of good stuff. So you can do any of your basic digital painting that you would do in Photoshop. You can do it in Affinity. And then at the click of a button, you're over in the vector workspace, right? So sketching a logo and then vectorizing it is one operation, an operation in a single piece of software. Whereas in Adobe, you're oftentimes jumping between two or more softwares to get that kind of thing done, right? So, and I could go on and on about Affinity. I think it's one of the better purchases that I've made as a creative professional. Um, and not onerous at all. 120, I think, at the time that I bought it. It's around that range still, I think. I don't think it's any more than 200. In fact, let me look up what is the current Affinity Suite. And they do deals as well, so depending on when you purchase, you might get a really good deal. Affinity Suite price. Yeah, so they're at 164 right now. 164 gets you the whole suite, all three apps, right? And so you can see, right? So yeah, this is Designer, and we'll open these softwares up and take a look at them on stream at different points as well. Designer, really great, really great set of tools in here for doing vector-based and bitmap-based illustration and combining the two. Um, and there's a lot of tools in here that I haven't even explored, in exporting tools and tools for sort of managing your colors and just the sort of thing that designers in general, designers who have to work in 2D, uh, the sort of things that you need, right? If you understand your fundamentals, then this is kind of a godsend of a tool, right? If you only need one of them, and you might have seen that as well, $70. perpetual license, right? And then for the iPad as well. The iPad versions of these apps are also very good. Uh, $20 each, right? And then, yeah, 160 one time gets you everything. It's a fantastic deal. It's a fantastic, fantastic deal. Designer does the illustration stuff. Photo is, sort of photo editing, so it's got features akin to Photoshop and it's got features akin to Lightroom, right? Great, great retouching tools, and they've got a whole brush system in here as well if you want to go that route. Color grading, great selection tools in here. I highly recommend. And I haven't gotten as much into Publisher yet, but this is where you do sort of page layouts, right? Um, Similar to InDesign. There is a free software called Scribus, which I've heard is also worth looking into. This is similar to InDesign as well, or to Affinity Publisher. I don't know as much about it, but I may spend some time looking at this software as well, just to see. I'm thinking about ways of building like sort of templates for pitch decks and doing different like graphic novels and stuff that hopefully at some point. So, um, getting into sort of publisher style software, layout software like this would be is sort of on my list. On my list of things to explore. It's something that I've never really spent that much time with, a little bit, but it's not really core to my workflow, so I've generally avoided it. Uh, but no more. So obviously you can see there's a wide range of software out there, and that's one of the first things that you should know. There's a lot of different software in the world. There's a lot. You don't have to, and you really shouldn't if you want to be sort of successful and independent and in control of your own work and not kind of tied to the the sort of whims of the economy as they occur, right? Um, you gotta get into different kinds of software. You gotta get into what's out there and think about what's out there and try different things out, play around with different things, right? This is what we do, okay? If there's a new piece of painting software out there and you've never heard about it and just give it a shot, maybe it'll change everything for you. My work focuses a lot on obviously drawing and painting, illustration, animation, and I'm doing more and more video work, and 3D is also a big part of what I do, right? Uh, if you do 3D work, you should have a copy of Blender on your computer. I don't know what you're doing if you don't have a copy of Blender on your computer. There's not really that much other than Blender that you will ever need, like truly need, as a 3D artist, right? Anything else is really just doing like specialized work, right? And making certain processes more directly accessible, right? I might be kind of tripping a little bit here, right? Of course, there are particular things that, if you're doing game design, for example, right? Blender's not a game engine, so you might want to look up things like Unity and Unreal. I'm not hearing great things about Unity nowadays, so maybe we gotta start thinking about taking this one off the list, right? But Unreal, for sure, it you can work with the full piece of software for free. And it is a very widely used piece of software and it does a lot of stuff. It's very powerful. It's worth getting into. It is not, it is not a 3D program. It is a game engine. Okay? There's an important difference. Unreal Engine is not for creating 3D objects. It's for composing 3D objects, right? There are particular things that you can create in Unreal Engine, but the tools for creating stuff in Unreal Engine, whole cloth, out of nothing, are fairly limited. The amount of things that you can do just opening up Unreal Engine and trying to make something are fairly limited, right? Within a few minutes, you're going to be kicked out to your web browser to look for some model to download or to another piece of 3D software or 2D software to create an asset, right? That's generally the thing with Unreal. And in that way, Unreal Engine, I think, should be thought of almost more like how you think about something like DaVinci or video editing software, right? You can't sit down in something like DaVinci and just make something from scratch. You can kind of, right? You could like make some graphics and some text and do some funky stuff with some effects and like solids and gradients or whatever, but you're going to be fairly limited, right? If you really want to make something in DaVinci, you got to get yourself a camera, right? Or a piece of animation software that you can render images out of, right? Something. You need some source that the software is composing together for you. Unreal is very similar, okay? 3D work, the majority of 3D work, if you're really doing 3D work, is making 3D assets of some kind or another, right? And then you go through, you compose them. If you're working in a team and you're like kind of, you're just focused on the cameras or something like that, right? Um, but when you're especially when you're first getting into 3D work and you're learning the fundamentals, what you're largely doing is understanding how things can be built in a 3D environment in general, how things are created in 3D, what it means for something to be in 3D, right? If you don't understand the difference between a mesh object and a curve and a camera and a null empty object and a light object and all this kind of stuff, you don't understand basic concepts of 3D space and ordinates and coordinates and sort of the relationship between axes and all that kind of, it doesn't matter if you're an animator or a camera person or a level designer. You might not be the person who's hired to build assets, but you're still going to have a hard time if you don't know the fundamentals of what things are in 3D and how they come to be, right? Um, and Blender is exactly the software that you need to go to if you want to really unpack all of that stuff, right? Unreal isn't going to get you there, right? So you may be more interested in Unreal and in game engines at the end of the day. That's great. Get a copy of Blender anyway on your machine because you're gonna need it, right? Um, and your only other alternatives are software that costs multiple hundreds, if not more than $1,000 every year, uh, just to be able to access. So you want a copy of Blender, right? And unfortunately, we're in a position right now where Blender is really your only option for robust 3D software that is not prohibitively expensive, right? There's some other tools that can do some of these things for you as well out there, but they are very, very limited, right? Uh, for example, I'm a huge fan of 3D Code. If you're interested in sculpting specifically and sort of like, can't spell right now, 3D Code, okay? It's a really solid piece of software, very easy to get into, fairly intuitive. You can sculpt, you can do some limited modeling, you can do texture painting, you can do retopology, uh, UV unwrapping, you can work with the normals a little bit on your object, or at least like normal painting. Uh, I mean, you can bake stuff and export and all of that kind of good thing, right? There's no rigging. There's no full 3D space. You're kind of orbiting that one object the whole time in 3D Code. You're not composing scenes. There's no cameras. The rendering is really just for preview purposes primarily. It's not a fully featured rendering engine at all. You can't render animations in it, right? But if you're doing asset creation specifically, 3D Coat is incredibly solid, especially if you're interested in potential alternatives to things like Substance and ZBrush, right? Uh, I love ZBrush. I've always loved ZBrush. If you can be in ZBrush, go ahead and get into ZBrush. It's a real treat, right? Um, Unfortunately, it is at a point right now where it is, much like Adobe software, incredibly expensive to get into, and you don't own it. Right? So like I very much caution you about against becoming dependent on ZBrush, right? It's worth getting into ZBrush and getting very good at it, especially if it's going to be like your daily job. It's worth it, right? Um, but handle with care, right? Cultivate alternatives. And that's where something like 3D Coat, which is a perpetual license, or Blender, which is open source and free, uh, come into the picture. Blender also has very robust sculpting tools. Part of why I don't use 3D Code as much these days is because Blender honestly does about as well, if not better, at certain things than 3D Code. And I can also do all the rest of the 3D process in Blender as well. So, uh, I love you 3D Code, but I'm not like a character modeler, right? I'm not a character sculptor, right? I'm not like sculpting like for 3D printing all the time or something. Like I'm just not being a sculptor is not my primary creative outlet these days. So 3D Coat is just kind of drifted to the back of my attention, right? Um, what is a lot more relevant to me at the moment is video, right? And this is another situation where, there's not a whole lot of options for you out there, but DaVinci Resolve is kind of OP, especially with where DaVinci Resolve is at after the update for DaVinci 20. Specifically, I'm thinking about the compositing tools in DaVinci, but just as an overall video editing suite, you can't ask for more, right? There's a free version of DaVinci Resolve that has most of the features that you'll ever want, right? They keep a couple of features locked up, you know. But the perpetual license isn't even that crazy. It's like I think it's like $300 right now for the whole thing. Um, DaVinci Resolve. So DaVinci right now, DaVinci right now is selling for $295 for the fully featured studio version. Folks, if you don't know what's in this software, y'all got to be prepared to be amazed, okay? First of all, DaVinci is actual industry standard software. It is used in the industry, it is used in Hollywood. It's not necessarily used for everything, but the color grading tool specifically in DaVinci and the integration between their software and their hardware, because Blackmagic is a hardware company as well, is so robust that you kind of don't want to be using anything else, right? As you can see from these clips, this thing is being used in top level work, okay? Uh, and with DaVinci Resolve 20, there's a lot more features that have been added. So you can see, yeah, this is the kind of hardware setups that they market as well, right? A lot of like, you know, high-end studio, like everybody gets into the room and like precisely adjusts the level of green and the midtones with a dedicated dial, right? Uh, and really great tools for editing. Essentially, the way that they have the software set up is that there are multiple different kind of pages or workspaces, right? One for editing, one for color grading, one for audio, and this Fusion suite, which is essentially a node-based compositor. If y'all don't know about node-based compositing, it's that's where the magic is happening these days, especially in animation, right? Um, the fact that DaVinci now supports fully node-based compositing for 3D scenes is huge. We're gonna start seeing some incredible stuff come out of DaVinci. Just the idea of being able to use DaVinci and Blender together, for example, at this level. Oh, it makes me tingle, my guy. It makes me so freaking excited. Uh, Specifically, like let's just look at the fusion stuff, right? This is what we're talking about. We're talking about taking actual 3D data, positions of vertices, normal maps, object ID, positions of lights, etc., and being able to pipe that 3D data into a node graph that allows you to then adjust the qualities of the image, of the output image, as a function of the input 3D data, right? So if you want to mask certain things out in the distance, or you want to apply textures to certain things, or you want to distort or texture edges in interesting ways, there's so much cool stuff that you can do once you have access to 3D data in a node-based compositor. And the Fusion compositor is already a very robust compositor. It's basically the kind of work that you can do in After Effects, right? But rather than having that be layer-based, it's exploded out into a node graph, and you can adjust those inputs in a more refined way, right? So y'all, this is a $300 piece of software, okay? Like understand, 300 bucks, you own this for the rest of your life, okay? Not necessarily the rest of your life. I mean, these licenses, they can fuck with these perpetual licenses too sometimes, but DaVinci is, Blackmagic has been very, very freaking fair with their licenses as well, and people get free updates for a good long period of time after the fact and all that. So this is a company that I think deserves more appreciation and attention, especially within the independent creative world, right? This is industry standard Hollywood level big studio tools that they are making so accessible to independent creators. So, get you a copy of DaVinci Resolve, okay? Even just the free version, just mess around with it, right? Uh, so as you can tell, right, there's a lot of different cool stuff. Different amazing tools. We have not looked at a single Adobe tool. We've not looked at a single Autodesk tool. We've not looked at a single Maxon tool. And I could keep going and like talking about all of these amazing, amazing things that are being built out there that are available for people like me. There's plasticity that once we start talking about like kind of NURBS and node-based modeling stuff and like funky pieces of software that people are just sort of releasing and you can mess around with for free. And then there's if you're interested in generative images and in generative tech, open source and free is kind of the only way to go. And that's something else that we'll get into a little bit as well, just sort of like how this way of thinking about creative software and creativity starts to overlap with and change the conversation around generative technology as well, right? So that's sort of an overview of what all I'm going to be talking to you guys about over the coming weeks and months, right? A final note here is about pipelines and workflows, okay? What we're trying to do, what we're trying to think about is how do I create something just like I can't create a whole film by myself. I can't create a whole film with just one tool, right? I'm going to need multiple different tools and multiple different processes, and those different tools and processes need to relate to each other, need to overlap, need to interact, right? And that's what in the sort of standard industry context gets called a pipeline, right? Or you might think of as like a workflow. Um, I don't think about it so much as like a kind of linear trajectory from starting with one tool or process on the one side and progressing to another tool or process at the end. You sort of move linearly through, right? That's how a lot of times people at least start to conceive of things in Hollywood, right? But in reality, things almost never work that way, right? These processes kind of loop back on each other and things get sort of revisited over time and readjusted over time. And sometimes you need to go all the way through a certain process to realize that you need to go all the way through that same process again. And it can be messy, right? So I personally think about it less in terms of like a pipeline and more in terms of maybe like a circuit, right? Uh, that like energy goes into the circuit and gets scrambled around through a bunch of different devices and so forth, and it gets sort of transformed, and then some kind of output is delivered on the other end, right? Maybe it's an image or a sound, or it's like a controller for a device or something like that. Um, I think about it more in terms of circuitry, right? Or you could think about it in terms of like an ecosystem, right? So I think that's like maybe, and we'll sort of play around with some of this language and analogies as we go, right? But the idea is basically that you have a lot of these different tools, right? Tools that help you paint, tools that help you write, tools that help you build 3D objects or visualize colors or place cameras in different scenes and or think about proportions or perspective or whatever, right? All of these tools, they have inputs, they have outputs, they work in different ways and they're kind of responding to different fundamental skill sets, right? So you have to sort of come to the tool with a perspective of what you want to do and what the larger process is here. And that's really what's going to allow you to get the most out of those tools, right? So like if you're just thinking about how do I use Krita, then you're not really using Krita to the best of its abilities, right? But if you're thinking about like how do I make a scene wherein a character does this and it needs to have this sort of mood and lighting and it's based on this period in history and all that. Now you've got a lot more to go off of and you can realize like, oh, I need to do a sketch in Krita, export that to Blender, model the blockout shapes, then send the render of the blockouts back to Krita for a redraw. Then I send that back to Blender where I'm going to model out the specific assets. I'm going to do a composition in there. Then I'm going to send it back to Krita for like paint. And I'm going to sort of reproject textures onto the thing, UV map everything. I need to set up a multi-pass render setup in Blender so I can kick out my Cryptomats to DaVinci, etc., etc. Right? There's a whole series of different things that need to be done in different places and in different ways that once you sort of understand overall where am I trying to get to, where am I starting from and where am I trying to get to, and what am I bringing to the table, how do I get there, right? Then you can sort of see like, oh, these are like these different softwares, these different tools, these are pieces of a bridge that I'm building, right? And it changes the conversation too about things like pricing, right? Maybe there's a core tool that does something in a very particular way that, it costs $300, but I need that process. If I spend the $300 on that thing, then everything else can be free, right? That's the sort of way that I like to think about it, you know? Um, yeah, so this is just sort of the beginnings of a larger conversation, as I said, on creative independence, on building your own processes, building your own creative circuits, right? Your own creative ecosystems, you know? As a result of having this conversation, we are going to end up talking more and more about just sort of the fundamentals, right? When we're talking about something like drawing or painting or modeling, what do we really mean by that? You know? The more you understand about the fundamentals themselves, and this can be the this is a conversation you can have at any level of your creative development, right? You don't just learn the fundamentals when you're in school or when you're a kid, and then you know them, and then you're done, and you go on and you make stuff. You're always sort of coming back to these fundamental ideas and these fundamental techniques and skills and reinterrogating them and reinterpreting them, right? The fundamentals are a living, evolving set of things, the things that you are kind of positioning at the core of your creative process and that are always sort of shifting and unfolding as you evolve as a creator, right? So you can't just learn the fundamentals and be done with it, right? uh, and in particular, if you're going to be thinking about maybe how do I shift some things in my creative process, or how do I get away from an exploitative license, right? You're going to have to think a little bit about your fundamentals, right? What exactly is it that I do? A lot of times the tools that we're using, right? For example, Adobe tools. If you're using Adobe tools all the time, it can start to obscure certain processes for you. You start thinking that the work that's done in Adobe Illustrator and the work that's done in Photoshop and the work that's done in Adobe Animate are like three very different kinds of work that are organized in very different ways, right? But if you've been using Krita, then you realize that what happens in Animate and what happens in Photoshop are kind of the same thing, right? That like laying out a background and sketching out and developing an environment, or sort of sketching out a scene or a character or whatever, very quickly falls into animating it, right? Thinking about this thing in motion as part of a storyboard sequence or as part of the beginnings of a film even, right? The process in Adobe is a digital reinterpretation of 20th century analog tools, you know? And those 20th century analog tools themselves, a lot of times, are very, very kind of contingent, right? That they're built in a particular way at a particular time, right? Think of the way that animation was done at Disney, right? And the sort of strict breakdown between rough animation to ink and paint, and the way that backgrounds are separated from the way that the characters are treated, and the sort of process of approvals and all of that. That was the way things had to be done, largely because of the tools, right? Because this is all being done on paper and celluloid, and we need to photograph each of these plates, and then we need to arrange these plates in a very precisely timed manner, and we need to adjust the position of backgrounds in response to. It's a very complex process to do manually, right? Digitally, a lot of those problems don't really exist in the same way. You can digitally work on an animation and still be refining that animation in full color, right? Uh, Depending on the types of tools you're using, maybe you're doing it in 3D, maybe you're doing an interpolated spline kind of animation, or you're doing it with vector shapes. Maybe you are doing like a 2D bitmap, like very traditional frame by frame hand drawn process. But because you're using something like TV Paint or because you're using something like Krita, you can very quickly block in color or block in silhouettes at the very least, right? At the very least, your roughs might look very different, you know? So it forces us to ask the question again, what is animation actually? Right? What exactly is the fundamental thing that my psyche is doing in conjunction with my hands to produce this thing that we call animation, right? You come back to these fundamentals time and again, right? I do this all the time with drawing and painting, always finding new ways to draw and paint. Nowadays, like 3D is a very big part of how I paint. The idea that building a three-dimensional space would be part of a painting process is not obvious, especially, 100 years ago, right? Uh, and again, same thing with things like video and film. There are fundamental things that are independent of the tools that you're using that apply to tools in general, and that apply to human perception and human psychology, that you're constantly sort of relearning and reinterrogating and re-exploring. That's the fundamentals, right? And the more you're able to sort of live in that space, the more independent of particular tools and software you can be, right? So I, for example, I love using Blender, and Blender is one of my favorite freaking tools ever. If Blender disappeared, I would be sad and upset for sure, for sure. But I know I could learn to do the same thing somewhere else, so long as there is some kind of 3D software out there, right? Hopefully I can afford it. Whatever the tool is, right? And if I have to learn to model in a very different kind of way, or have to learn 3D in a very different kind of way, or kind of bridge the gap in the short term with a couple of different tools, then I can figure out how to do it, right? Because now I understand things like space and points and normals and parenting and hierarchy and relationships between objects and all this kind of thing. Blender's just a way of doing that, right? Um, and then we're also going to be talking a little bit about processes, which for me is sort of living in between this larger goal of creative independence and building your own workflow, your own creative ecosystem that's sustainable. Um, and this sort of like fundamental issue of the fundamentals, right? The issue of those concepts and practices and structures that allow you to do this work in the first place, right? In between there are processes, right? This is what I was talking about before about you sit down in Blender and you're going to do something, you're going to make something. Well, what does that actually look like, right? Um, what are you going to make, right? How are you going to do that? You've got fundamental skills and fundamental knowledge about sort of objects and shapes and structure and narrative and all this sort of thing floating around in your head. And now you've got a tool in your hand and you can use that tool to actually build a thing, right? Uh, are you trying to build a 2D image? Are you trying to create a 3D object, right? Are there ways in which these different tools and processes can relate to each other? Are we talking about analog? Are we talking about digital? Are we talking about something that moves? Are we talking about something that's static, right? And then what are you sort of putting into that? Do you need to do some research, right? Research for me is a very important process to think about. Where do you get your reference imagery from? What's inspiring you? right? All of this goes into the idea of research. Um, so yeah, just to sort of zoom out a little bit, this gives you a sense of, the map, the territory that we're trying to cover in the coming weeks and months. This here kind of gives you a sense of where I'd like to end up with all of this at the end of the day, right? For now, we're just doing, very informal discussion streams and research streams and creative streams where I'm just going to be drawing and painting and making stuff in 3D and maybe doing some video editing or whatever. And we'll talk about these things, learn about these things as we go. There's not a specific syllabus or trajectory that we're meant to follow at this point. It's more open-ended exploration, fragments, right? Um, Out of that, I'm going to be able to start pulling more and more sort of highlights, edited videos, right? Um, and then as I have time, I don't know if I'll actually get this far this summer, but I would really love to start organizing these things into some more properly edited tutorials or videos, or even just having things like resources and documents available for people who are interested, links, etc., is going to be hopefully valuable for folks. And if it's valuable for you, I'd love to hear back. Um, so that kind of covers everything that I wanted to cover today. Um, but before we close out, I wanted to share some really cool discoveries that I made recently when it comes to some processes in Krita. And I know you can do this sort of thing in Photoshop as well, but I haven't seen folks do this so much, and I figured it'd be like a pretty fun little thing to look at, right? So I'm just sketching in a pretty loose scene here. I'm not sure exactly what it's gonna be. Something simple. It's summer, it's LA. I'm gonna draw a highway overpass because that's where the hell we are, you know? Um, there's an overpass kind of close to my house that makes me think of this. I'm just being kind of loose with it. There's nothing like super realistic that I'm trying to do at this point. I just want some interesting shapes and lines to work off of. If you're not aware, the straight edge tool in Krita is so much better than Photoshop's. I think I said something about this before, but you really got to be aware if you're not. You really got to be aware if you're not. This is the superior straight edge tool. Just bound right to the V key. You can see right there, I just like to do a little bit of selection and delete sometimes. I keep my polygon lasso and my freehand lasso bound to separate hotkeys because I use them both so much. Like you don't really use just the one or whatever, right? Like I genuinely use both. And for this, I'm just gonna create a new layer. I'm not really doing real perspective with this, as you can tell. I'm just sort of eyeballing things and making it up as I go. I don't feel like being that precise today. And I'll just go through and grab those stray lines, anything that I don't need. Just kind of get it out of there. Right? All right, cool. And that should be enough for me for now. Now there's some cool stuff that I've found recently. Let's pop open our layers tab. I'm just going to merge those two back together. Bring the overall opacity down, and I'm going to put in a new layer. And I'm actually going to start with a white fill. Group these guys so that I have access to the which is which. That's right. Now we're just gonna ink this in. Be fairly loose about it. Or just something kind of like that, right? So there you go. There you go. And for that light post, I'm gonna do something a little special. See that in a second. Yeah. I'm just gonna get those buildings in. I kind of want to do. I'm gonna show you all this trick now. So if we go to the layer styles in Krita and apply a stroke layer style, reduce the width to about 3 pixels. That might be too big, but we can adjust it later. Select our line color. Check this out. I'm just going to lasso out these building shapes. Fill them with white. And look what we got here. Alright, we now have an outline on that layer. Isn't that great? And in fact, I can do this multiple times. I'm just going to apply another stroke on here real quick, make it a little thicker because it's going to be ahead of that other layer. Just lasso out that shape. Fill it, flip it. And then for these buildings, I'm going to get in there with brush. But this isn't even as far as it goes, okay? This isn't even as far as it goes. I'm just creating silhouettes for these buildings because I need them for later, right? But if I go in here and I apply that same stroke layer style, and I select a pattern brush, like this leaf pattern that I made, then I instantly have those trees blocked in. How convenient is that? Sketch back on top. I can also come in here pop in another one of these layer styles. And there we go. So that's some ways to quickly block in some line art, right? Something else that we can do with this. Let me get those other buildings in there. So we can call this one completo. And I can do some thorough breakdowns of different line art tools and so on if folks are interested. Line art is one of those things. It can be just kind of tricky. Getting good tools for it, figuring out good workflows for it, especially digitally, can be a big lifesaver if that's the sort of thing that you do. And now I'm just sort of merging these down so that they're kind of rasterized. The effect remains procedural until you kind of merge it. And I just like to kind of go back over it and add a little bit more kind of manual polish to some bits and pieces of these. I don't really want to create windows for these buildings right now, because creating windows is a bit of a pain in the neck, and I haven't found a really great way to do it yet. But I wanted to show you all some interesting shading techniques as well. And I don't really like how thick the outline is on this bridge, so I'm going to actually go into the layer styles again, jump at that stroke, and bump that down to a 3. Maybe a 2. It already had a good stroke on there, so um, that's fine. Alright, so if I change this background color, you can see everything's kind of filled, which is actually just fine for what I'm about to do. Every object has its own mask around it, which is good. I'm going to start by adding in a bit of a soft gradient here. Alright, that's fine. Merge that in. And then we're just going to kind of go from the back and softly add some gradients to things. And what I want to do for this is make sure my brush is set to a multiply so that when I go over this, the lines stay nice and dark, right? Right. Same thing here. And we can get some help from our lasso. I haven't really picked a light direction, which is a mistake. But we'll just say it's a pretty high key light. Okay. Just gonna grab these areas specifically as well. Go. And make sure my alpha lock is on. Darken those up. And let's grab this as well. And then I'm just going to insert a little bit of shade here also. Excellent. Go back to these back buildings because I want to up that corner a little bit. And let's grab these two spots on the bridge. Okay. And now I kind of want to give this whole thing a bit of a funky look. Let me just spend a little time on this light post before I get too far away from it, because it is going to bother me. Small object like that should not be this busy. That feels better. Something like that. Okay. Kind of goofy, kind of simple. I wanted to show you all some cool shading techniques of this. Some cool filter techniques. So we're going to start off with a halftone. Which is already going to make things look really cool. I don't know what I did there. I broke my filter. Reapply that filter layer and go into the halftone. This is already looking kind of cool, but it's not doing everything that I wanted to do. So another thing that we can do is if we want to duplicate this group, hide the original, flatten it, duplicate it again, clip it to the one below, and now we're going to put in a blur filter. And you can already start to see what that does, right? And the blur and the halftone interact in a really satisfying way. And you start displacing those lines underneath it. Duplicate the base layer again and put it above the blur filter. And so what that means is now we come in and edit these properties. Alright, so that's the sharp version. Actually, I did that wrong. I'm going to set this to normal. I'm going to set the blurred version to multiply. And essentially what we're doing here is mixing between finding different orderings and mixing between let's see what I did. I thought I put in a blur filter and I merged it in. My mistake. Okay, so we've got our default image here. Duplicate that. And then we're going to add a filter layer. Set to Gaussian blur. Click OK. And this one ought to be set to multiply. I see. These guys got to be grouped. There we go. So it just gives us a little bit of that offset, a little bit more texture, right, around those edges. And the final cool thing is to set the whole group to dissolve and bring down the opacity just a little bit. And you see there's all this additional texture that gets introduced just by setting this to dissolve and lowering the opacity. And this whole stack is fully procedural, right? So if I wanted to come back in here, add in another layer, and maybe add some lines to the building here. Or maybe we wanted to do our little trick again with the layer style stroke, set that down to 3. Really quickly get some vehicle shapes going on here. I thought this was a really cool little formula. There's a lot of cool stuff you can start finding once you let yourself kind of mess around with things like filters and layer styles and making those interact with blending modes, right? All right. Yeah, that's like it's a really crunchy, textural feeling little Brita panel, maybe like a little panel in your graphic novel or something like that. Um, all Krita, 100% free software, right? And pretty quick and easy to set up. So hopefully you found some of this stuff interesting. If you got the chance to watch any of it, hopefully my audio wasn't too screwed up at any point or nothing like that. And I appreciate y'all. We'll be coming back for more. Stay tuned. Stay creative. Always save your work. Try to find cool things to do. Let me not show y'all NDA material. Um, Look for a place to save this. Streams, yeah, there we go. 511. Wow, wow, wow. All right, there we go. That's a stream. And if by any chance you saw any of this, any of this at any point. Thank you. I appreciate your interest in the work that I do, and I hope to see y'all come back for more. Much appreciated, and yeah, it's I'll have a fully blessed summer. Cheers, guys.